Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the web conference today. You are here for Let's Connect, questions and conversations around preventing sexual harassment in virtual at-home workspaces and educational settings. My name is Tori Vandelin. I am joining on behalf of Prevent Connect and Valor US. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor US, formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the US government, CDC, or Valor. We do have some objectives for our time together today. So we hope that folks will be able to describe what sexual harassment looks like and kind of how it differs from the February 2020 and prior context, but how it looks different now that for folks' work and education, folks are mostly still at home and connecting virtually with one another. We also want folks to be able to identify what are some of those specific risk factors for virtual sexual harassment. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about potential adaptations for, a lot of the workplace harassment prevention work was done prior to the pandemic. So how can folks adapt that for a virtual work from home, study from home context? And Ashley, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about the timing of this web conference.
Thanks, Tori. So if you all have been participating in any of the National Sexual Violence Resource Center's Sexual Assault Awareness Month campaign activities, or if you've accessed any of their resources, then you know that the theme of this year's SAM is we can build safe online spaces. And, I think in some ways it really is kind of the sign of the times. But also a real recognition that any environment can be a place where abusive behavior can occur. And likewise, any environment can be a place where we are actively creating equitable spaces and safe spaces and healthy spaces. And that we really do have some of these strategies already to be able to create safe environments. And so the question really becomes, how does that translate to a virtual space? But I just wanted to lift that up because it is still for the next couple of days, officially April. And I put a link if you wanted to get more information about NSVRC's SAM 2021 campaign. We also had an opportunity, and Tori, if you'd go to the next slide, we had an opportunity at Prevent Connect to speak with NSVRC. We talked with Susan Sullivan at NSVRC to learn more about creating safe online spaces and really how folks who are engaged in prevention efforts could get involved from home. And so it's a two-part podcast that we invite you to take a listen to it if you want to hear more about, why NSVRC decided that this was the theme for 2021 and some of their ideas for, what are our roles in really creating safe online spaces. And Tori, I know that, this topic it's not new. People have, unfortunately been experiencing sexual harassment virtually for a long time. But I think because so many of us really moved a lot of our work and educational settings and ways that we connected with one another virtually over the last, 14, 15 months, that there's been more conversations about sexual harassment in virtual spaces. And I know that you wrote a blog about that, so I wanted to pass it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. And, you're right. There has been a lot of conversations and news stories and articles about what harassment looks like as we're all working from different workspaces. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was, kind of a misconception that because people weren't in person anymore, that there would be less violence. And I think this is really our opportunity to, talk about how, no, that hasn't been the case. Harassment is a form of violence, and it's something that still has been occurring. It's been occurring a little bit differently, but it's those power imbalances and power structures are still there. And, it's something that like not just you and I who are working from home, workers who are like us have been experiencing in this pandemic too. Folks have really been uplifting how tip service workers are more vulnerable to harassment. I know One Fair Wage was calling it masculine harassment. It's a really insidious combination of sexual harassment and harassing tipped workers over mask requirements and other COVID social distancing measures. So this has been a conversation for a long time, and I think it's really important that we are having that conversation today in a very like specific context that we're all into. And when we talk about sexual harassment and preventing it, I think a lot of like what I had been taught, early in my career is that, preventing sexual violence, preventing sexual harassment, just preventing the act of it, like that in and of itself is a low but necessary bar for society. What we're really doing is wanting to create more equitable systems, because we know that things like sexual harassment are connected to those same root causes of violence. Like the one on the right side of the screen showing Lydia Guy Ortiz's wheel of oppression's connection to violence. And so I think it's important to not only think about how do we prevent sexual harassment, but what would workplaces without sexual or racial harassment look like? How do we work towards what we want? Working towards that more equitable environment versus, what we just want to eliminate. And Ashley, I know you have some more knowledge and background about this connection with technology too.
Yeah, thanks, Tori. I think that those connections are really important, and it's also, something that I think is really obvious, that harmful and abusive and violent behaviors that can happen in person can also happen virtually. And so technology kind of becomes just another, tool that can be used to hurt people, to harass people, to really interrupt someone's life. And so some of the things, and I know we're going to get some really great examples of some specific ways that sexual harassment can show up virtually that does look really different than how it would show up in person, but it can also look pretty similar, right? It just, again, the technology becomes just another tool. So I wanted to share that. I think, Tori, if you move to the next slide, there's really a deep impact being created in terms of traumas that people are experiencing both individually and collectively, and moving so much of our communication and connection virtually in the past year has kind of added a new layer to that. In one way, there's no escape, right? Technology is something that people have access to 24 hours a day. And so it becomes kind of like this thing that you really can't get away from. And I know that one of the resources from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center was really looking at online abuse and trauma. And so again, I think, Tori, those connections that you made were not necessarily just talking about sexual harassment, because there are lots of other types of harassment that people are experiencing online. We're doing this really difficult work. We're dealing with some real systemic challenges around oppression. And then you add harassment virtually into the mix. And so there's deep impact being felt. And if you'll go to the next slide, you said this really well, that the work to prevent sexual harassment virtually and in person is really about, working to create equitable systems and promote equity. And preventing sexual harassment, it's not just about preventing sexual harassment, right? We know that there's connections to other forms of violence, other forms of abuse and harassment. And so to prevent sexual harassment, we also need to address racial inequity, racial harassment, and other forms of oppression and inequities that foster these really dangerous beliefs and practices and behaviors that then also lead to informing policy. And so after we hear from our guests individually, we are going to be inviting them back for a panel discussion where we can kind of continue to unpack these connections between oppression and sexual harassment in virtual spaces. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. But I also just wanted to lay out some questions. You know, when we titled this web conference, we specifically said questions and conversations because we don't necessarily have the answers, but we do have some questions. And so some of the questions that I'm thinking about today and really welcome you to think about and provide your insights on are, how do we create safe online spaces? What is an online environment that is safe and respectful take? How do we kind of shift the conversation from safety in virtual spaces to creating healthy, respectful spaces, right? A lot of stuff when we talk about technology facilitated abuse is about how do we keep ourselves safe, right? Don't do this, don't do that, make sure you put this on your phone. But how do we create the environments where we don't have to have those safety protocols because people are showing up in a respectful way? And then, you know, we know that we have strategies from the CDC technical packages, strategies and approaches about preventing sexual violence and intimate partner violence in person spaces. And so do these strategies and approaches also work virtually? Do they make sense in a virtual setting? And then finally, and we're going to actually ask you all a question about this, is what are we doing in terms of our own practices that promote or diminish equity in virtual spaces? And so the question that we're posing that we'd love to hear from you all on is, how do your own practices promote equity in virtual spaces? What are some things that you have, that you do, that you've thought about that really work to promote equity in virtual spaces? And so we'd love to get some thoughts from you all. And, you know, I'm thinking about things such as like access. What are the routines that we have set up in virtual spaces? What does participation look like? What are the expectations? So there's kind of a lot of different places we could go with that question. So we'd love to hear from you all about that. And Tori, you know, I'll keep my eye on the text chat and see what's coming up for folks, but I think it would be great if we introduced our first guest.
Yeah, absolutely. I am really excited to introduce our first guest today. We have Erin Poke joining us from Futures Without Violence. Erin is the staff attorney for outreach and engagement. Erin focuses on Futures workplace safety and judicial education initiatives. He has developed curricula and trained individuals from varied disciplines, including public and private employers and workers, judges, advocates, and professional athletes. Prior to joining Futures, Erin served as an attorney advisor with the DC office of the tenant advocate, where he fought for affordable and safe housing. Erin also advocated for equal voting rights with a national nonprofit and practiced trial law with a prominent firm that specializes in civil rights matters. He is a graduate of Georgetown University and the University of South Carolina School of Law. Welcome, Erin.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And the picture that you see there right now, that's pre-pandemic Erin. And now you've got this hair that grew. This is post, or I guess, independency of the continued pandemic Erin. And hopefully everyone will get vaccinated. If we're doing this next year, I'll have it down to my shoulders. So I'm just laughing because I'm looking at that picture and I'm wondering who that guy is. I'm happy to be here. I'm with an organization called Futures Without Violence. So we operate Workplaces Respond. It's a national resource center that focuses on the intersections of gender-based violence and workers and the capacity to work and the health and safety of workplaces as a whole. And, you know, we have spent many years, well over a decade before I joined Futures, working with employers, unions, advocates, you know, workers, worker centers, to really focus on a lot of these equity intersections that were just discussed, making sure that the lessons and the approaches and the best practices that we offer take into consideration all of the different types of workplaces, but really center the fact that any act against another that is rooted in power and control is essentially and usually an assertion against the identity of that person, and is fueled and facilitated by persistent inequity, uh, white supremacy, homophobia, misogyny, all of the different names that we have that identify animus that we extend towards another based on their identity and based on the historic marginalization of identity. So if we can go to the next slide, I think it's crucial to review what the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has for quite some time defined as sexual harassment, because the body of federal law that is designed and intended for us to vindicate any issue that we may experience with harassment in the workplace is rooted in discrimination, rooted in the notion that if someone is pursuing an act of power and control in the form of sexual harassment, that as typically the case law says, an aggression against one's gender identity. I say that as a context setting because there's no way to talk about these issues, be it in person, be it virtually, be it a traditional office occupation or an occupation where you're interacting with people in a restaurant context or in a agricultural context or in a hotel room context, really has to be applied to that circumstance to really mind the opportunities that exist for people to assert themselves in a power and control context against another. Now, the virtual Zoom world has been one that has primarily been identified with people who work in a traditional office context. But I think it's important to note that although we're speaking of virtual harassment, we know that regardless of one's occupation, even if it's something where you are engaging with a customer base or some sort of other base in person, there are always applications, be it checking in with supervisors or what may happen in the future that might necessarily require people, unfortunately, regardless of their connections with technology and their abilities to access technology, to interact with each other virtually. So I say that because we must know that when we're advocating that we don't exclude people who may not be on Zoom as much as we are, or as we are now, because that's not equitable, and that also excludes people who may assert themselves virtually in other forms, although the engagement isn't regularly virtually. So we want everyone to be paying attention to these issues. And so the EEOC pretty clearly defines sexual harassment in the form of, or provides the examples of, unwelcome sexual advances, requests for favors, other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. So the examples that we give to make sure that people see that how this can look in the virtual world is as simple as the demand that someone turn on their camera, right? And then the addition of some compliment or some statement, it's never really a compliment, about their appearance. So the way that we would mitigate that possibility is to create a culture, and I see this happening in the chat box, where people don't feel that they have to turn on their camera if they don't want to. That's something that is good to get ahead of. Or a compliment about the background, or a comment about the background that one sees. That example being, nice headboard. Have you dented the wall? Very, very problematic statement, clearly to me. So the best practice there would be to make sure that employees are encouraged that, and I see this in the chat box as well, that if they want to use a virtual background in the event that they choose to turn their cameras on, that's a good idea. And I've actually adopted the practice now of always using a virtual background. I wasn't concerned about my background, but I realized one day that it might be a good model for leadership for people to see my comfort in using a background that's virtual. And then maybe there are others who might occupy different bases of power in the workplace who might say, well, hey, if Aaron's doing that, then it's allowed here, it's fine, I'll do it too. Just those little moments of encouragement is how you can create a culture of prevention way ahead of the problem, right? Not being reactive. You've heard it all, you've seen journalists do it, this notion that pants are optional today. Making sure that people understand the jokes that aren't funny in the office are not funny virtual. It's just, it's not, don't joke, right? If you wouldn't say it in the office, you wouldn't say it virtually. Now, also make sure you understand that that might not work for some people because some people might say things like that in the office. So in your advocacy and your statements of that, and this will come up with some of my co-presenters later, you have to sort of maybe restate some of the norms that would be present in the office to make sure that people know that they've been named and they're indicated in the virtual context. So the other thing about the definition of sexual harassment is that it is actionable because the acceptance or rejection of that conduct inherently becomes a term of that person's employment. With that lack of parity and power in a workplace, people naturally feel that if I stand up for myself in this context, that might set me back at work. So the example there being, I thought you wanted to get ahead in this field, right? Which is something that you would hear in the in-person context, but imagine if someone's commenting, you know, I don't notice that you have your camera on a lot. If you want to get ahead in this field, and if you want to be seen, you should start turning your camera on. And that's a sign of grooming. That's a preliminary act that might ultimately find itself in a much more overtly sexual context. And then the other thing, definitionally, is this conduct can also unreasonably interfere with performance. It's clearly distracting and traumatic if you're hearing this level of aggression, and creates an intimidating or hostile work environment, right? But the equitable principle that exists here is the understanding that when people are concerned about standing up for themselves, or when they do stand up for themselves, the easiest thing that an aggressor, especially a supervisor, an aggressor with power, can do is begin to marginalize that person, begin to limit their career advancement, begin to set them aside, perhaps to keep the conduct quiet, or to intimidate that person into not reporting. So the manifestation of that we have to look out for in the virtual context is this notion that you can be marginalized virtually and you don't even know it. You know, actually, you're not needed on this call anymore. Or when you're not even present, you hear a comment, or you hear of a comment among others where you were getting invited to a meeting, but then it's determined for some odd reason that you're not needed there anymore. And as bystanders, as colleagues, those are the things that we should look out for, because you may not know the background there, but perhaps if you're concerned that your friend, your colleague is being marginalized or set aside or passed over or pushed away, it might be a good opportunity to check with them and say, you know, hey, you used to come to this meeting. Any reason why? Do you have any knowledge as to why you're not here anymore? And they may say it's safe and confidential and you've let all the other groundwork that we all know as advocates in this field. Well, you know, I think it might be because this person came on to me a couple of weeks ago and I stood up for myself, and all of a sudden I couldn't come to that meeting anymore. Sometimes a safe question or just to check in on how you're doing can reveal a world of hurt. Well, obviously doing that in a considered fashion. And there are a lot of lessons as to how to do that that are available in other venues. And then finally, the ultimate act that can be done virtually is to shame someone and to embarrass them, or to engage in revenge porn, or to, you know, use the virtual, the cyber world, the cyber stalking elements of it, disseminate widely something that would be embarrassing to that person. And I think it's important to note for people who might be experiencing that fear that in the event that they may have consented to sharing a photograph of themselves in one context, that's not ongoing consent, right? So, the rule should be, hey, be very careful in how you interact with people by way of flirting and sharing photos in the workplace. But you can't say that every now and then there might not be thoroughly consensual, purely equal, two coworkers who are dating and neither one of them has a problem with it until they do. And I think the survivor of that needs to know that that consent is revocable. And just because they consented before does not authorize the person who has now changed their feelings about them and is now asserting themselves in an act of power and control to now say, I had it coming. I shouldn't have sent that photo in the first place. That's victim blaming, and that is a self-blame circumstance that's quite understandable, but we should act to counsel people through so that they know that they don't deserve that, even if at some point they previously consented. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So why is there higher risk in the virtual environment? Now, my colleague will get into this more in depth after I go, so I'll go through this quickly, give them all the time that they need. But there's a higher risk because people have to be told, the rules still apply here. It doesn't matter that you're in your house and you might have sweats on and your dog's there and your family's there. This is a workplace. When you are on company time, if you will, you are as accountable to the rules and of conduct for this workplace as you would have been if you were inside of an office that's controlled by the workplace. And I think it's important to make sure that people remember it's no different than going to that happy hour after work, right? So if you go to happy hour with your coworkers and you sexually harass a coworker after work, it is not a defense that the workplace didn't control that bar, because the only reason why you're all together is because you work together. So that is clearly a work-oriented function, and you have to return to each other the next day, which creates that level of uncomfort and discomfort and hostility. That's the same at home. People need to be told the rules still apply at home. When you're dealing with someone that you know only because you work with them, or even if you knew them before, your engagement of them is primarily work-related. That's work time, the rules still apply. Decreased support, right? There's no posters in my home to remind me that I have an employee assistance program available. There's no EEOC phone number in my break room, also known as my kitchen, to remind me that there's help available for me out there. So we have to, as workplace leaders and advocates, we have to actually take the extra mile to remind our colleagues and people who we supervise, everyone in the workplace, that all of the availability of resources and support that would be present if you're in the office, those are present for you when you're at home too. And it might just take that reminder to get people to remember, oh, you're right. Actually, I do have rights here in my house. And I have this story about a few months ago. I was talking to a coworker and I was complaining about all these office supplies I was ordering off Amazon. And my coworker's like, why are you ordering office supplies off Amazon? We have a process for ordering office supplies. Just call the number or whatever that process is. And then it dawned on me, you're right. I actually can order office supplies home the same way I would do at work. But there was something in my brain that told me that since I was at home, in my chair, on my desk, with my lamp, with my walls, that everything was different here. And it was that gentle reminder that I still had a right for our company to buy me office supplies that reminded me that that right existed, and that opportunity and that especially that money existed. So if something can be as unclear from an office supply perspective for a guy like me, it could certainly be concerning for someone who is looking for resources or may need to be connected to resources because of that. People may start drinking a little bit earlier at home, right? Happy hour might start earlier. I work for an organization that has an office on the East Coast and West Coast. So sometimes when I'm on a 6 p.m. call and my colleagues are at 3 o'clock, you better believe that I've been wanting to pour my evening libation while I'm concluding that call. And I'm not the only one. So all of the drivers of lowered inhibitions are magnified when people are acting in the comfort of their home. And that has to be understood. And then finally, where are our boundaries, right? I have never been more accessible than I am right now. I'm on Zoom all day. I'm on Slack all day. People are emailing me. People are texting me. There's an assumption, especially at the height of the pandemic, that I'm around some sort of electronic device. So the response time is heightened and the time of engagement is heightened. So I think it's important for us to remember that just because we can reach each other easier doesn't mean that boundaries don't exist. And also the opportunity that exists for bad actors to exploit those boundaries are manifest as well because of the frequency of opportunity or the frequency of connection that we get because we, you can't really hide when everyone knows that you're at home as much as you might want to try. So I'm going to wrap it up there so that we can have time for my co-presenters. And I don't know if it would be appropriate for me to respond to some of these questions now, or perhaps it might be better for me to monitor the chat box and perhaps provide some answers verbally. I'll ask my moderators to guide in that regard, because I definitely don't want to take up too much time away from my go-through.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Aaron. So a couple things. First, I just want to thank you for walking us through the examples of what virtual sexual harassment looks like and how it can differ from in-person experiences. I think one comment that you made at the beginning around, acts that are rooted in power and control are really targeted at the identity of the person, that's really sticking with me. So I just wanted to lift that up. But I also think that some of the examples you gave, and I haven't figured out exactly why I'm thinking this, but they seem to me to be almost harder to recognize as sexual harassment, both even maybe as the intended target and as bystanders. And I don't know if it's because for a lot of people, interacting this way 100% virtually is newer. I mean, I know that's not the case across the board. And I think your point that there are many different types of workspaces is also really important. So I'm not quite sure why, but some of the examples I was thinking, I don't know if I would necessarily make that connection right away. And so I think this conversation is so important because of that. And I think it also kind of goes into some of the questions that you're getting in the chat, Aaron, and if you don't mind responding to them via the chat, and we can kind of summarize at the end. But thinking about workplaces who just, as Kiana said, are not prepared to address or don't understand, are not able to kind of spot it or even know how to foster those norms that could prevent it. So I just want to thank you, and we're going to move ahead for the sake of time, but we will hear from you a little bit later. And I did want to just ask our audience too, what are some of the other things that are really driving sexual harassment in virtual spaces? What are some examples that you might be thinking of? We'd love to get that insight from you all. And while you think about that, I do want to introduce us to our next set of guests. So I want to introduce you to Holly Ryder-Milkovic. Holly is the Vice President of Impact at EverFi, focusing on sexual and gender-based discrimination, harassment, and violence prevention and response. Previously, Holly directed the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center at the University of Michigan. And Holly provided expertise to President Obama's White House Task Force on best practices for campus-based sexual and intimate partner violence prevention and response efforts, and also represented four-year colleges and universities in the Federal Negotiated Rulemaking Committee for the 2013 Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. And Holly is bringing over 2 decades of experience in violence prevention and response and in higher education to her role at EverFi. So welcome, Holly. And then I also want to introduce you all to Elizabeth Bill. Elizabeth is the Senior Vice President of Workplace Culture at EverFi, a leading provider of workplace training. She's EverFi's subject matter expert on preventing harassment, discrimination, and retaliation, and creating positive, thriving workplace cultures. Prior to joining EverFi, Elizabeth was the General Counsel and Chief Ethics Officer of the Society for Human Resource Management, and she's also served as a legal and policy advisor to a former vice chair of the EEOC, as well as an employment law attorney. Elizabeth has provided training for EEO investigators, HR professionals, and employment law attorneys on complex workplace issues, and her work has been cited by several news outlets, including National Public Radio, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and the New York Times. So gosh, Holly and Elizabeth, and like Erin, you all are just bringing so much expertise and experience around this issue. And so I'm wondering if you all, building off of those really great examples that Erin walked us through, if you would talk to us about some of the risk factors that you have identified for virtual sexual harassment.
Absolutely. I'll get us started, and then I'd like to turn it over to Holly to talk about, in light of these risk factors, what strategies can we use and adapt to the virtual workspace. So again, I'm Elizabeth Bill. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am really delighted to be with you here today. I'm going to talk about risk factors from two different perspectives. One is risk of incidence. So what are the conditional factors that lead to an increased risk of harassment happening in an organization, in an institution, or to an individual? And then I'm also going to talk about risk from an impact perspective. And that's where I'd actually like to start here, zooming up a little bit. In our work, we know, of course, that preventing harm to individuals is the most compelling case for the prevention work that we do. But we also know that when we're working with a number of organizations, companies, institutions, and the like, that's not always the most compelling lever for action, particularly when we're dealing with sometimes some senior leaders in those institutions. So one thing I like to do is to touch on some data here that you can use to build the business case for why an organization or institution should double down on their prevention investments, particularly in the area of harassment and anti-harassment, I should say. So I wanted to give you some data points here. Now, of course, when you talk to organizations or institutions, what's often top of mind for them is legal costs, the costs of defending a lawsuit or defending a charge before the EEOC, judgments, settlements, and things like that. And for good reason, right? In 2020 alone, the EEOC received over 6,500 charges of sexual harassment. And the settlements that resulted from those charges really exceeded $65 million. And that's not even counting lawsuits that were outside of the EEOC process, $65 million. But a number of organizations are also starting to realize, and we can lift this up as well, that the harm to organizations for not doing this work well goes far beyond legal and legal ramifications. And in fact, are far deeper than legal ramifications and the damages that can result from that. So going down here on the slide, as on the right, damage to brand and reputation. We've seen when these incidences become public, particularly if the harm is committed by someone at very senior position, it can be very harmful to the organization's reputation and their brand standing. In the higher ed arena, one study found that a scandal that hits the newspapers, if you will, particularly if it's a long form article about a scandal, it can cause a 10% drop in student applications for 2 years following that scandal. That's the equivalent of a 10 ranking drop in the US News and World Report college and university rankings. But of course, in a social media world that we're in today, the Glassdoor ranking society, or the ability to check sites like Glassdoor, things don't have to reach the front page of a newspaper or a website in order to have those sort of devastating brand results. Another area of damage that can occur to an organization that is helpful to lift up is turnover. One study found that women who've been harassed are 6.5 times more likely to leave an organization than those who haven't. Another study found that 8 out of 10 women, or excuse me, women who've experienced harassment change jobs within 2 years. Turnover is a data point that many organizations are very attuned to because it's incredibly expensive to have individuals turnover. And of course, it hurts productivity and morale as well. One last thing I'll point out about this, employee turnover costs actually constitute the largest economic cost of harassment, much more so than those legal damages that I talked about just a second ago. Productivity, of course, can be harmed. One study found that for every individual that's impacted by harassment in an organization, that organization loses $22,500 in productivity. There are health costs, of course. Many here on this call are well aware of the psychological and physical consequences that can result from an individual experiencing sexual harassment, such as depression, anxiety, headaches, high blood pressure, even PTSD in 1 out of 10. And those, of course, can then have institutional ramifications, increased health plan costs, missed work days, things like that. Stock prices can decline. And ultimately, all of this can really impact an employer's ability to recruit and retain top talent. In this day and age where more and more employees are wanting to align themselves with an employer whose values are like their own and whose workplace cultures are equitable and inclusive, these incidences of harassment will undermine that and will really harm their ability to gain and retain that talent that they're looking for. I did see that, I think I saw that Tori may have placed in the chat a cost calculator tool that my organization developed. It's a really fantastic tool to help organizations quickly calculate what the economic risks are for harassment in their workplace. They can just insert a couple of data points, the number of employees they have, the percentage of their workforce that is female, their median salary. And if they don't know those for sure, they can use the Bureau of Labor Statistics data averages in those points. But just to give you, and then it will tell you what the economic impact of all of these factors put together is of harassment currently this year in their workplace. I just entered a couple of numbers for an organization with 1,000 employees, for example, using national averages of salary. The annual cost is $8.6 million lost in a year. Holly, I'd love to turn it over to you. Did you have anything you'd like to add on this particular slide?
You know, I think it is really important to hone in on the way in which those core mission and the business of higher ed drivers are impacted when we are insufficiently seeking to actually prevent harassment, as well as invest in robust, appropriate responses, so that when behaviors become apparent or known to the institution, that they're taking really effective action to make sure that the behavior is ended and that the conditions that created the context for that behavior are remedied so that it does not occur in the future. So I would just additionally add that as well and turn it back to you, Elizabeth.
Great, thanks so much for that, Holly. If we could go to the next slide. Now let's take a look at different kinds of risk. We're talking here today about the digital environment and of course, or remote environment as well. And of course, that context makes a difference. But at the foundational level, research has shown, and the EEOC itself actually has put together a list of risk factors that are context agnostic in terms of in-person versus remote. Because, as Erin and Tori mentioned earlier, harassment is fundamentally about power and control, and those can manifest in any type of workspace. Just how they manifest, the details, of course, can vary, as Erin so poignantly pointed out. So, as I mentioned, the EEOC has put together in its task force report on the study of harassment, and I'd be happy to chat a link to that here. Actually, here's the name of it as well. You can Google that name. I'd be happy to include a link as well. A list of about 12 environmental risk factors that may increase the likelihood of harassment occurring in a particular organization or in a particular unit or group of employees in an organization. And what they have shared is that these sort of organizational conditions are actually more predictive of harassment occurring than the characteristics of the individuals within them. So what are these? Now, there's about 12, as I mentioned, and I lifted up about 6 here that I thought were particularly relevant to this particular conversation. None of these are in themselves predictive, I should say, they're correlations, but they do help guide us to know what types of organizations may be particularly at risk, what kind of organizational structures may increase risk, and where we would want to target our prevention efforts in a more amplified way. So starting in the top left, decentralized workplaces. So the EEOC has said that situations where senior leadership is far removed physically from, or organizationally, structurally, from frontline employees or individual contributors. When senior leadership is not present, that could increase the risk of harassment occurring. Although when they wrote the document, they were thinking more of sort of retail stores, restaurants, small local offices, or in the higher ed context, maybe research stations and the like. This certainly can be applied to our at-home virtual workspaces as well. We are removed from senior leadership who can provide that oversight and accountability for our colleagues and supervisors who may be acting in harmful ways. Isolated workers, so people who are working in isolation, though they can be unfortunately targeted by those who would harass and cause harm, because those individuals feel empowered because there are no witnesses often to harassment, or there may be fewer witnesses. Another one is rainmakers, or we've heard these situations where this person is a superstar faculty member, or this person is the superstar leader or salesperson or what have you. And that can often cause organizations to not hold them accountable in the same way. Likewise, that person may feel that they are exempt from the rules and therefore can do as they please without being checked. Younger employees, younger adults, those who are early in their career may be less aware of the rules, less aware of laws and what is acceptable conduct at work. So they may not raise their hand and say, I don't feel comfortable with this. Likewise, they may not know, or they may not know that what they're doing is inappropriate if they're the one who is engaging in the behavior. Cultural and languages differences, this is another risk factor. This can be as a result of English fluency issues, and so they may not be able to fully understand some of those posters on the wall, or certainly, as you mentioned, Aaron, that we may not have posters on the wall anymore in these remote environments, so they may not be as aware, so says the EEOC, of their rights. And likewise, sometimes in organizations where there is diversity of identities, but lack of inclusion, that you can see more harassment in those areas as well. The dominant group may abuse their social power and their organizational power over the non-dominant group if there is lack of an effort to support inclusion. And finally, alcohol, as was mentioned by Aaron, the consumption of alcohol in a workplace or during work hours can impair our judgment. And so notwithstanding the fact that most employers do have rules against consuming alcohol at work. Holly, I'll pause there again. I'd love to hear your thoughts about these risk factors.
Well, I love these, well, I hate, but I'm glad that we're putting these environmental risk factors. And I also want to, and I will add it to the chat, point out a parallel or complementary resource for higher education specifically, powerful report coming out from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in 2019 that really looked at a lot of these factors as well, and they found those parallels in higher education. I want to point out just a few that I think are particularly relevant here. We've already talked about isolated workers and decentralized workplaces. Certainly, this is conditions that have been present in higher education for a long time, certainly previous to the pandemic. And so, I think when we're thinking about these issues, let's also remember that even after we go back to a more in-person workplace as the norm in higher education, that virtual context will continue for many, many workers, be they literally on the side of a mountain in Azerbaijan, or they're working the third shift cleaning our facilities. So those conditions are going to continue to remain. The rainmaker high value employee, gosh, have we ever seen the headlines associated with those high status or high reputation individuals in higher education for whom the lens of scrutiny has not been as sharp, has continuously been a place where there have been sources of harm that have been revealed for individuals. And so that is certainly a place where we need to look. And it also is a reason why graduate students and early in career faculty members can be particularly vulnerable. So I wanted to point that out. And last but not least, that significant number of young adults in the workplace context or as workers is so especially relevant in the higher education environment. Not only, of course, do we have lots of young adults in the context, but we also have young adults who are early in career as well. So thinking not just about our paid employees, but also our students who are in internships, our students who are in residencies, our students who are serving in assistant roles, all of those are individuals who can be more vulnerable to victimization in this kind of an environment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Holly. And just rounding out the conversation about risk factors, and I'm going to address this very quickly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Holly to talk about those strategies for prevention. Adding to the perfect storm of conditions that we already have, we have some unique contextual factors of today's COVID post-2020 environment that we are in, as well as, arising from all of those events. And so we do have an increased incidence of employee, faculty, staff stress and fatigue. The unprecedented levels that we have seen over the past year can lead to misconduct and inappropriate behavior. This of course does not excuse the behavior, but it is important to understand how those dynamics can interplay with the incidents that we're seeing today. Casualness and incivility. Many of us have surely seen this in our own lives online, but digital civility is at its lowest level in many years. According to the Microsoft Digital Civility Index, things have gotten worse online, and there are certain topics that tend to drive that and to manifest that incivility. And in fact, according to that index, topics about physical appearance, comments about physical appearance is the #1 form of digital incivility. We can see that connection to sexual harassment, and sexual orientation is the #3 form comments of digital incivility right now happening online. So these are exacerbating the trends that we're hearing about digital harassment. Erin mentioned about the lack of in-person witnesses. And not only does that make it more difficult to monitor, but of course, it also reduces the ability of bystanders to engage in those pro-social bystander intervention techniques that can help prevent and address harm when it does occur. And lack of guidance about online behavior. Organizations really need to make sure that they are communicating that those policies that prohibit behavior, harassment in particular, lack of inclusion, bias, et cetera, apply with equal weight in a remote environment. And they need to be proactive in communicating that, providing examples like Erin provided, and the like. So Holly, I'm going to turn it over to you to continue on. Thank you.
I am so lucky. I get to talk about the ways in which we transform these risk factors into protective factors, because I want to really highlight one of the things that you noted, Elizabeth, which is that in all of those risk factors, what we saw as being outside generally of our control, individual factors were the smallest portion, and the context or the environmental factors that we all have an opportunity to help shape are the most likely to also be the most effective. So let's now talk about what this comprehensive harassment prevention strategy can look like digitally and online. Because what I want us to remember is that, the point that Erin brought up early on, as did Tori and Ashley, which is that, the conditions or the context under which power and control are being leveraged are different in a digital environment, but many of the best practices remain consistent. And one of which is that we need to really be thinking holistically when we seek to prevent harassment. And what does that look like? Well, for a lot of folks, what you deliver to individuals, that programming piece starting at the top, is like the beginning and the end of their harassment prevention strategy. I really want for us to dig deeper here and start down at the bottom and think about harassment prevention. Really begins with ensuring that your institution or your organization or those that you're working with have system-wide buy-in, visible commitment. Oftentimes there are those sort of champions that are embedded within the work that may not have their hands on the firm grips of power, and you are very, very important. And one of the ways in which you are so important is in building that system-wide buy-in and those voices of senior leaders. What we know is that research actually in the higher ed context, but applied more broadly to other organizations, note that when senior leaders talk about sexual harassment, preventing sexual harassment in ways that is informed, that identifies that it is a significant issue, and that lays out a concrete, specific approach for addressing it within the organization, it changes people's minds, and that's a causal link, one of the most powerful. So we want to start there at institutionalization, and then moving from having that senior leader buy-in, have system-wide or organization-wide support, having the right resources in place to be able to support this effort in an ongoing way and not a pop-up and drop-down, pop-up and drop-down way, is those critical processes. So this is where we're gathering information, gathering data, doing that strategic planning to actually lay out what it is that the organization actually needs, where your strengths are, as well as where are those places where additional effort is going to be most effective. Having that goal setting, that also ensures when you goal set, you actually ensure that you have a target that you're actually driving towards and you know when you're going to get there. All of those pieces then are reinforced by policies. And, I liked what one of the participants said as one of her efforts for getting started. And she said, I make sure that folks understand what the policies are and what the expectations are. And that is a really great articulation of how important the articulation of policies are, making sure that individuals understand the values and the expectations of institutions and organizations, making sure that there is strong accountability measures as well as support for individuals who are harmed, and that accountability and support are visible within the organization. One of the things that we hear over and over again is, I'm not going to bring something forward because I don't know of anyone who's ever heard of anyone who's ever had anything happen. So the extent to which we can make these our policies visible in the accountability as well as visible in the enactment is very, very important. And then all of those pieces, all of those elements that create the context under which it is most likely that individuals are going to behave in ways that are respectful, and that negative or disrespectful or hostile behavior is going to be discouraged, is then reinforced by programming, so that we're building the skills for individuals to be able to notice situations and intervene, that we are building skills to make sure that individuals who do engage in ways that are helpful and pro-social are rewarded, and that everybody sees that they have a role to play as well. You know, what we want is to make sure that in that both universal, so everybody gets the training, as well as role-specific training, especially for supervisors and others who have leadership roles, that they have the tools that they need to be able to create these safe, respectful, inclusive, engaging environments for everybody to work and learn. Let's go ahead and go forward and see what this might look like. Here are some ideas in the digital environment. If you can move the slide forward, please.
We're there. Comprehensive harassment prevention and action.
All right, thank you. So when we're looking at institutionalization, what might that mean? In the digital environment, we want to make sure that leaders are, even with so many other efforts on their plates, certainly this is a time when there's a lot of attention that leaders are needing to pay to a lot of different areas, making sure that they're continuing to message about harassment prevention and talking about it in the digital environment. Setting forward their organizational or institutional expectations, also dispelling misperceptions that, because, as you know, Erin noted earlier, as did Elizabeth, just because we're in the virtual environment does not mean that harassment is not occurring. So maintaining or even increasing that senior leadership messaging can be a great place. So critical processes. Lots of organizations are consistently gathering information about their employees or workforce's experience in the digital environment. As you are asking those questions about, you know, do you feel safe? Is your employee or is your supervisor supporting you? Do you have flexible work-life balance? Are you getting enough resources during this time? Asking questions about whether or not individuals are experiencing harassment or other discriminatory behavior is a really important part of the data collection. It helps you have a fuller picture of the information, what's going on within your workforce, and it also communicates as well that this is an issue that's important. What I'll note is, as you're gathering data, as you're asking for this information, you're also forming a relationship of trust with your employees. And that relationship of trust is reinforced when you then share back that information with as much transparency as possible when your workforce provides that to you. That can be a fantastic springboard for conversations about, again, reinforcing what the policies are, reinforcing what the resources are, and identifying where there are gaps that your organization can make some changes moving forward to be able to more effectively address this issue. Policies, again, we're reinforcing those expectations of norms, but also looking at the ways in which your policies may have some gaps. So to Erin's point, does your workplace policies related to alcohol or substance use explicitly address the in-person work environment or when you're on working hours externally? Are you looking at ways in which other policies can create a more welcoming environment for individuals? So that's a place to both reinforce what already exists and make sure that your policies are continuing to reflect the digital environment. And then last but not least, again, we come to the apex of the triangle, looking at programming. And we want to continue to reinforce that universal and specific training on harassment prevention, even in the virtual environment, or maybe especially in the virtual environment. But this is the thing that I want for you to consider. When you are looking at your trainings, do you include examples and scenarios that are focused on those remote work contexts? So one of the things that I've been so encouraged by so many workforces starting to adopt is bystander intervention training approaches when it comes to harassment prevention. The research literature tells us that these is one of the most effective means to deliver individual programming. However, lots of those bystander intervention training programs have been created, or the examples have been created in the in-person work environment. And so when we think about, gosh, how do those work? We have to notice situations. We have to interpret them as being problematic or something we need to address. We need to know how to take action, and then we need to execute. Well, all of those skills are different in the digital environment than they are in the in-person environment. So as you're doing that programming, making sure that you're reinforcing what to be looking for in the digital context helps to make sure that you're equipping your workforce with the tools that they need to enact what they want. So overwhelmingly, our employees want to be in safe, respectful, inclusive work environments, and they want to be able to support their colleagues in doing the same. So we need to make sure, the onus is on us, really, to make sure that we are adjusting that training to provide them the tools for the situation that they find themselves in. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back to you, Tori.
I'm actually gonna I'm gonna take it from you, Holly. But I just want to thank you and Elizabeth, for, gosh, I mean, there was a lot of interest in some of the data and research that Elizabeth shared in our text chat, and so that really painted a picture of how can we make the case that this is something that we should all be taking seriously. I think we should, just because it's the right thing to do and because I love people and want people to not be harmed. But I think that some of that data that was shared can also really make the case when there are people in power that maybe don't share some of those values. And then I just really appreciate this framework of comprehensive prevention that you laid out, and the examples of what that could look like virtually. So this is just so great. I do want to move and introduce you all to Adriana Perez from the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, because Adriana has actually been doing work to prevent sexual harassment in workplaces, in-person workplaces, through a project that they have. And just really quickly about Adriana has experience as a shelter advocate and youth advocate, and that time in direct service really encouraged her to focus on prevention and community level change. Adriana is a prevention program coordinator, and her goal is to make prevention work accessible and doable for everyone to play their part in it. So Adriana, I'd love to pass this on to you and hear about how you've been addressing sexual harassment in workplaces before COVID, and then any thoughts that you have about adapting your current work.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. And we can just pop right into the next slide. I'll jump right in. So I want to just share everyone kind of our theory of change and how we got to do work around workspaces. So this really started from a lot of feedback we were hearing from youth that we had worked with in the past or we're currently working with, and then a lot of our member insights. And our members across Minnesota are typically rape crisis centers, and they are doing a lot of really incredible, great work directly with youth. And from the feedback they've all been sharing is we were hearing things that youth were really feeling set up for the real world, and that they were receiving this education on topics like consent and boundaries, healthy relationships, but then the adults in their lives weren't receiving that same information, which was really making it hard for them to feel empowered in these skills out in their community. We even heard from one member working directly with the LGBTQ+ youth in their community that many of those students were feeling more tension and negative experiences within their own homes than within a school, which is where that member originally was trying to do some work around preventing violence. And this really showed us that these key insights from youth is that they want engagement in education and prevention efforts within their communities more than necessarily primarily directly with them. And so from those insights, we really wanted to build this idea of, so how do we continue to engage more with these adults, parents, general community members in kind of different ways, since we are still seeing that challenge with prevention of sexual violence, especially within our communities. So we began to think, like, how do we reach a large amount of adults altogether? Well, where do most adults go? They go to work, right? And so that's what really led us to this idea of starting to engage in prevention efforts within workspaces. And we thought this was very similar to how to reach the widest range of youth. We tend to go to a school, and we're applying that in that same way to reach the widest amount of adults we can to share and provide education to. We should go where they are. So that was important for us to go directly to our audience instead of continuing to try and ask them to come to us. And so that was really our journey and how we decided at MnCASA to start doing workplace sexual violence prevention. Next slide, please. So introducing our Rosemary Project, which is our MnCASA prevention initiative. This really started out as a more kind of general awareness building initiative, how to get conversations started around prevention, because after the Me Too movement really took off, we were getting a lot of questions of like, well, what can I do? What is my role in preventing sexual violence? And so we created this initiative built off a couple of resources. We also have 2 animated videos that show really actionable, tangible, simple prevention steps that anyone in a community can take to make changes in their daily lives. All of the images on my slide are clips or images pulled directly from those videos, so you can kind of get the vibe of that work. And so we wanted to take something that we already had as an organization and build off of that versus kind of rebuilding the wheel or starting over. And we wanted to take the same course concepts of our Rosemary Project and target that to a specific audience, which would be workplace settings. So how could we make sexual violence prevention actionable, digestible, help everyone see they had their own role to play within prevention, but within a workspace? So again, we're just kind of taking our Rosemary Project and moving it into a Rosemary Project 2.0, Rosemary Project Workspaces kind of vibe. And we are also using the CDC Stop SV technical package, which I believe someone else had mentioned earlier. And we are focusing kind of on that empowering women and girls to support equity within workplaces. The work we will be doing at MnCASA and with the Rosemary Project Workspaces will be kind of a wider equity focus, not just specifically on women and girls, but that is kind of that language the CDC is currently using. So that is an audience we'll be working with, as well as other populations who we know have experienced higher rates of sexual violence within a workplace. So this approach will also build off another program area of ours at MnCASA, which is around healthy relationships. And so again, hearing that youth really want adults in their community to have this education, we found it really important to provide that space for adults to receive this education, which is again why we're going into those workspaces. And a big piece of our work at MnCASA has really been a strong focus on policy. And over the last years, as Ashley mentioned, we have done some direct policy review and had one-on-one conversations with different businesses and organizations in our state about their policy work and different policy kind of ideas, structures, things you maybe want to avoid when writing a policy and figuring out your goal of why do you even have this policy? What does that mean and look like to you? And we just believe that policy is a really effective way to engage in community level change while having the widest impact. So kind of that like top down effect, which I'll talk a little bit more about. However, policy does come with a lot of challenges. So at the end of the day, policies are just words on paper if we don't actually properly share, train, and uphold them. And just changing the kind of language of a policy doesn't necessarily solve any problem. So we need to look at policy wider than just what the language and words on a piece of paper say. And I'm going to throw an assumption out there and in the chat, feel free to challenge me, but I want to guess that most of us are not actively reading our workplace policy books regularly. And so instead of operating and working out of those policy books, we really respond to workplace cultures and practices. And so Again, while holding up policy is really effective work, knowing that policies don't always directly impact the practices and cultures we experience in our work environments. Similar to how Holly kind of explained that pyramid, I think that really showed, a policy is not a end all be all fix. There's these other areas that really play into that work. So when we are talking about policy change, we're really talking about how do we challenge workplace culture while also having those procedures in place to be responsive when incidences of sexual harassment may occur. So we don't want to do all our eggs in that prevention basket, because we know folks have and will experience forms of sexual assault while those kind of balance out. So making sure folks know what to do if they need to report an incident. And I believe Holly and Elizabeth shared too about this idea of having people be bought in on all levels of policy work. So there has to be leadership, HR, staff, volunteers. Everyone needs to be really bought in on what these policies are, how they look like, and how they unfold. Leadership need to be familiar with them to uphold them. And if leadership is not implementing the policy, is it even really a policy that's happening? So all of this work is really multi-layered in that staff need to be bought in and understand the importance of the policy. They need to understand, why is that a benefit? What does that do for the organization and for them as staff? How is it having a positive impact? And leadership need to be able to answer that while also knowing the areas they need to uphold. So once everyone kind of has that clear understanding of the policy and its purpose, the next important step is making sure everyone is trained exactly on that policy. We had talked about those expectations and how they translate from an in-person workplace to online, and I will talk a little bit more on that, but that's where this piece is kind of tapping into, is what are these expectations? How are we trained on these policies? And that training should be happening multiple times throughout a year, so everyone is experiencing multiple dosage of the expectations regularly and together as a team. Typically, we recommend for folks to test out their policies by running a couple of scenarios. Policy may sound good on paper, but it might not actually work functionally in practice, especially with how a lot of our workplaces have shifted. I don't think you can look at a lot in your current workplace policy book and understand fully how it adapts to the online spaces we're now in. So really making sure we run some testing, some scenarios, do some role plays, that also helps people really learn and understand the way a policy works, so that everyone can be on that same page of what is this policy, how does it benefit us, and how do we engage with it. So I will pop to the next slide. So now that you have some context of kind of our journey and our theory and some of the work we've done, we've had to learn and adapt a lot this last year, which I'm sure many of you are on that same journey. There's been so many events the last year plus that have directly impacted our work at MNCASA in so many ways, and also our member programs. And we've just been learning and adapting. One of the biggest things that we've experienced is really trying to slow down to become more intentional in our work and focused on meeting the current prevention needs of folks. So a lot of our members really struggled with prevention efforts because it went on the back burner. Response really took the forefront during this last year, and that is important. I'm never going to discredit doing those direct services, being in response. I think we just know it's always that balancing act of when is prevention taking the lead and when are we doing those direct service pieces. So we did see that shift, that prevention really went on the back burner for folks this last year, which is to be expected. And that just helped us really kind of slow down our work to become more intentional. So I just want to be fully transparent. We have not moved a lot of work forward in this arena over the last year, but we have spent some time being reflective and learning on what do these shifts in our workplaces look like, and how do we even engage with workplaces to begin with. So I wanted to share some things we have learned from this adaptation. Again, that shift in priority of focus, like I shared, the idea of flexibility and professionalism. So like we have been talking about on and off through this webinar, is are we working from home or are we living at work? And those kind of feelings can be really complicated when for long periods of time, our workspaces and our, like literally this little square, right? Like this is where I work, but I'm within my home and like I'm welcoming you all into my home. which if we were having a normal meeting, you wouldn't be in this space. So really looking at this idea that working virtually and working online isn't just staying virtual. It is coming into our homes. And with that comes our animals who love to come say hi. If our children are homesick, if we even have room for desks in our house, or are we working from our couch or in our beds? These idea that we aren't just working from home. We are really living within our workspaces. And how do we balance making sure people are cared for, making sure people have what they need? Again, showing up in those ways professionally, while also knowing like we're people and life is really hard right now. So that's always kind of that ever tug we've been seeing is how do we be flexible for folks while also maintaining some of that professionalism? And then working within a home versus actually being in our workspace constantly within our home. And then somebody in the chat actually brought this up earlier around communication and connection is it's really hard to read intent over screen and email. We kind of put our own spin on what we're reading. So there's been so much around our communication that has changed. We've lost quick conversations with each other. We don't have kind of those water cooler conversations anymore. We have to be really mindful in scheduling time to make a phone call or to have a Zoom, and everything feels less organic in how we're communicating together. And we're not sharing kind of that energy anymore. I had heard on a previous Prevent Connect webinar that I'm just talking at my screen. You all can see me, you can hear me, but I don't like get kind of our energy back. And so we spend so many hours of a day giving all of our energy to a screen and to our computer without really receiving anything back to help fill us up on that connection with others. And so we're really seeing how that shift in how we talk to each other and just how we experience each other in a shared space virtually does not feel the same. So those are really our big key things that we've been thinking about and looking at in regards to how do we address those, one, as our own work organization as MnCASA, and then how do we help others who are really looking at already such a complicated arena of preventing violence within a workplace to now our workplace is massive. It's everyone's home. It's across the internet. So again, I think Ashley had said earlier, we maybe don't have answers for you today, but these are questions we've been thinking about and brainstorming on, and I'm hoping to plant a couple of seeds with all of you and engage in any conversation that you are all kind of also having around this to learn from each other. And then next slide. So I want to share some of the key takeaways we have learned and experienced at MnCASA through the couple of experiences we've had of connecting with businesses and wanting to move this work forward within a workspace. The first big lesson we had to learn is that when we say a workplace, that means a lot of different things. There is such a wide spectrum of what a workplace actually looks like. Is it an office? Is it a hospital? Is it a bar and restaurant? Is it where you get your haircut? There are just so many different places we work within that are structured and operate very differently. So really making sure we understand, and if you all are interested in doing this work, really understand the needs, the different structures, the laws, the types of environments that a workplace is. And it's not a one size fits all initiative. There's no umbrella work that can be done that can be plugged in necessarily to every single workspace. They are all really unique in what they do. So really being specific on the workspaces you want to work with and learning as much as you can about what is a workplace when you are talking about that and when you are connecting with people. And so speaking of connecting, partnerships are so key to this work. They're key to prevention work in general, and that stays with how are we doing workplace connection. So we see a lot of folks who want some quick, easy fixes when something maybe has happened. They've maybe been reported or called out online for some really bad practices, and they just want that easy Band-Aid. You come in, you give us a presentation, and suddenly our environment shifts. Or they want to check that box of the annual anti-violence, sexual harassment presentation that people love to just kind of roll their eyes at, right? So we really focus on how can you develop a partnership versus being a one and done kind of service for folks. because we're really trying to, again, change that practice and culture, not just adapt and update one policy to have major change. And so being a partner can look very different than being a service provider. We know that prevention is a long game. So we make it very clear with folks we want to work with that this is not a one and done. This is not a once a year presentation we come in to do. It's going to be us having a seat at the table with you all to do this work. So just remembering that prevention doesn't happen overnight. Sexual violence within a workplace and sexual harassment virtually cannot be solved with kind of that quick, easy fix. And it's totally okay to start those partnerships by doing the one-time presentations, because that's how you get your foot in the door. And we've seen that within the school setting as well. And then just working towards building that longer term connection to really engage in culture shift over time for that organization. And then finally, touching on that sexual harassment equity efforts, along with so many other violence prevention policies, cannot be standalone. We can't adapt or change one single policy or one specific area of policy and expect major change to happen. Preventing harm within a workplace is intersectional and ongoing work. And so it really is looking at not just a anti-sexual harassment policy, but everything else that could be impacting folks within a workspace. So onboarding, hiring, pay, literal physical space for people to move around, having access to internet. I know someone mentioned earlier that being rural is really challenging to have internet access. So this work is not just in a pocket, it really is intersectional and ongoing. So that is all kind of my takeaway for the bit of work we've dipped our toe in, and I'm happy to have any follow-up conversation or answer any questions with folks at another time.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I really appreciate, like, it feels so holistic, like in the way that it started with you know, listening to youth say that yeah, I mean, safety is school. For me, it's home that needs a little bit of help. And then to also you know, think about sexual harassment prevention in workplaces as holistically as you can too, and that workplaces are very different from one another to the next. So I'm sure folks have noticed we are running over on time. We are going to stay on for a few more minutes, not just because we have another text chat question for you all to ponder about how can we rethink the ways that we work together, but we really wanted our guests to have an opportunity to you know, revisit like this theme of equity. And you know, it's not just sexual harassment that we're preventing, but we're also trying to create workspaces that are equitable and anti-oppressive. So I heard that theme throughout all of our presenters, and I want to invite our presenters to unmute and just elaborate a little bit more on these connections between preventing oppression and the harms it causes, and the impacts on sexual harassment prevention too. So whoever wants to get started will probably aim for like a 6-minute conversation, if that's okay. And there are definitely opportunities for us to re-engage our guests at other points to publish some materials that are a little more in-depth too.
I don't mind kicking us off really quick, unless Aaron, you want to jump in.
Please do, go for it.
Great. I just kind of wanted to touch on that last statement I made of this work does not happen in that like silo just addressing sexual violence. And when we talk about addressing sexual violence as MNCASA, we are trying to talk about addressing oppression, and that those things are so interconnected. And within a workplace, we can see how these different barriers and policies and shifts really have that ripple effect in how one little thing really does impact everything. And that when we are showing up to work, we are hoping folks can show up as their authentic selves. And how does that look when we are currently kind of within a culture of like the United States and work culture really keeps people in tight boxes that don't allow them to safely show up as themselves or to express themselves. And so when we are talking about sexual violence and sexual harassment prevention within a workspace, we're really trying to have that hyper-focused lens of oppression and reducing those barriers for people.
That's absolutely consistent with what I was going to say. And there was a question in the chat box about, if you haven't quite started this discussion yet, I made a reply to it. I think that tracks this, which is exactly what Adriana just said. It's we can't have our anti-discrimination conversation and our anti-sexual harassment conversation and our general workplace safety conversations. I think the inclination is to do all that separately and to have a piece of paper that covers everything separately. And what we recommend is consistent with this conversation, which is engaging all workers, everyone in the workplace, of every pay grade, of every supervisory level, in a comprehensive discussion about what type of place you want to have, what kind of workplace culture you want to have. And that can integrate discussions about anti-discrimination, oppression, bias on the basis of marginalized identities. And when you do that, you begin to unpack people's experiences and how they intersect. And the example I often think of is a training I gave where a Black woman, this was a training that was after an organization had a person very publicly be exposed for being a sexual harasser for a number of years and had been protected by management. And a Black woman raised her hand in the training because we had created a framework to talk about it in the context of equity. And she said, I'm glad that you're talking about this because everyone around here is acting surprised that that person is a sexual harassment. I could have told you that they were a racist, a misogynist, and everything that you can imagine 10 years ago, because here's what they said to me about my identity 10 years ago. And back then, I couldn't tell you that it was sexual harassment, but I could tell you that that guy was a problem. And if I felt safe to say so, then I might have been able to protect other people from their aggression. So I think that's important to note. And I took that story to heart to realize that people come after you based on whatever they think they can assert against you. And that's not limited only to someone who is being sexually inappropriate.
I think that both of what you said is so really important. I want to add an additional layer. One of the things that Elizabeth and I have had the real privilege of engaging in over the last 3 months is building a new diversity, inclusion, and belonging course for workplaces, both corporate workplaces, organizations, as well as higher education. And it's two important lessons have jumped out to me. Number one, and this is also true for our student education, we need to make sure that as we are, for example, doing bystander intervention training, that we are reflecting back to and having our trainings reflect that an individual's identity makes a difference in how they notice events, how they interpret them as problems, whether or not they feel as though they have the ability to act in the moment, or whether or not their action may be construed as an additional form of violence. Whether or not whether your identity, the identity of the other person, makes a difference in whether or not you even see the situation. So we need to make sure that even as we are developing our trainings that are related to sexual and gender-based violence prevention, that they are reflecting the experiences and the identities of the individuals in the room, and reflecting that all of those pieces make a difference when it comes to, for example, bystander intervention. That we cannot act as though we or have trainings that presuppose, an identity neutral, which therefore would be the majoritarian identity perspective. So that is something that I think is really important that we keep in mind, in addition to the points Adriana and Erin you already made.
And this is Elizabeth. I agree with everything that you all said, and you all stated it beautifully. And I was going to say many of the same things, so I won't. I won't. I'll let your wonderful words speak for themselves. Of course, you know, Erin, you just said something that spurred a memory for me about a piece of research that Holly, you and I have talked about in some trainings before, and that is this sort of coincidence of sexual predation, sexual harassment with other behaviors in the workplace that indicate a disrespect for people's selves, people's work, and things like that. In fact, there's a paper, it is entitled sort of the Al Capone theory of harassment. And it basically said that very often, although you may not see the sexual harassment happening first, you may see these other warning signs, these signals of disrespect for process, policy, and people. So there tends to be this coincidence of people falsifying expense reports, plagiarizing, and otherwise being abusive in other areas. Sometimes those tend to manifest first before you see sexual harassment, but all of these come down to, as has been noted, oppression, power, and the like. And so when we see things percolating in one area, I think it does counsel us to make sure that we are taking a broad perspective and ensuring that harm is not occurring in other areas, whether in the sexual context or otherwise.
Thank you all so much. That is such a powerful conversation to end on here too, to really root ourselves in when we're preventing sexual harassment. We're preventing the root cause of it. We're addressing the root cause of it, which is that power and oppression and how people wield that in a workplace too. So I want to express my gratitude for you all for this discussion and for all the others that we had on this web conference today. We are over and out of time, but I do want folks to have an opportunity that they have the links to some of the resources from our presenters as well. Again, these are on the slides available on the website, and we will compile a list of resources and send them out for you all, in addition to some of the ones that were requested kind of on the fly here today too. So just wanted to thank everybody for joining the web conference today and for, the lively discussion and, just really appreciate being able to talk about this. I know that workplaces are starting to change again, but we also know that, I think Artie said it really well, just because we've all been working from home for so long doesn't mean we're all, snapping ready to come back. So these are going to be conversations that folks are going to continually have as our context changes and as it stabilizes as well. So thank you so much to all of our presenters, to Erin, Elizabeth, Holly, Adriana. I want to thank my colleague and co-host, Ashley Klein-Jimenez, and I want to thank our captioners at Aberdeen Captioning, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. This was a great conversation, and part of that was because of all of your input. So stay tuned to your inboxes for a survey, as well as the recording, the resources, everything we said we'd follow up on you with. This concludes today's web conference. Take care, everyone.